So, talk to me about the first time you actually heard the word consent, and in what context did you hear it?
So that's it's a very interesting, question. I think I must have heard of, consent for the very first time, in a formal educational institution. It's not something I had from home at the senior high school level, when the phenomenon of consent, was introduced, so to speak, as part of the modules that we had. I think formal sex education is not something that I personally got, all the way up until the secondary school, which is interesting because you would have been, mid-teens, towards the mid-teens by then.
So what did the men around you, within your family, within your community, what did you learn from them about sex?
I probably didn't learn anything directly, directly from them. I mean, I grew up in a very, rigid, well, rigid maybe too strong a word, in a home where, you have the father who typically had to redirect, practically every part of their life. So my father was home up until, senior high school level. I had a stepbrother as well who I suspect had similar experiences like mine, but he too also left, just about the time I turned 14. So these are men who immediately were in my immediate confines, who really never had a conversation around sex, and so, it was always about school books, come back home, that's it, that's just it. Which then means that a lot of what I would have learned, about sex would have been from friends, colleagues. When I think about it, as an adult, you realize that a lot of the values that you picked up, the majority from friends, were quite, were quite negative.
You said that from your friends, it was quite negative what you got. Just break that down for me. In what way was it negative? What did they share with you? What did you hear from them that makes you describe it that way?
Things like, for example, passing derogatory comments about the physique of a woman or a girl, for example, was usually the order of the day. Beyond just the commentary, people touching, young boys touching girls in manners that, they haven't consented to. Beyond that, you had, conversations about what some boys wanted to do to some of the girls, majority of which were very sexual and almost from a very commandeering position, a position that more often than not disrespected to a large extent the person of a woman, right? Particularly a young girl. I was one of the very younger kids, back in school. And so you usually looked up to those who were 17, 18, 16-year-olds. As a young 13 or 14-year-old, you looked up to them, for guidance. And these were the things that, you were picking up on.
So I want to stay with that moment of kind of navigating, being in a group with boys in your teenage years. I want to stay in what you saw the boys do. And so from you seeing that, what was your, how did you feel when you saw that, you heard that language, or you heard those boys discussing? Were you part of the conversation? Were you standing by, watching and listening? How were you navigating that space yourself?
I grew up in a home full of girls. I had 5 sisters. And so beyond the fact that there was no direct conversation around sex education, there were still some conversations around morals and how you needed to behave, etc. The subject of sex was taboo. So anything regarding that, you rarely spoke of. So even if you went out with the boys, hanged out, and anything of that sort happened, you never really came back home and spoke about it. I remember one time, and this was my very first time, ever hearing this. I was hanging out two of the very young boys. They were much older boys than I was, maybe 2-3 years older.
And what kind of age?
I must have been about 13 by then, so they must be, somewhere around 15, 16. And there was a girl who was next door neighbor, right? She was like the caretaker for the next door neighbor. And they had these little, I don't know if you remember these little corner stores. So she manages a corner store when everybody's gone to work. So one evening, people are not back home yet. We're all hanging out in front of the house. And then these two much, bigger boys started talking about, one of them was talking about having groped her before. And, telling the other guy that, yeah, that he's done that. And it's great, And so before they were helping her pack up the wares from the store back into the residence, and started hearing sounds. I started hearing sounds, with these individuals who were struggling. It looks as if they were struggling. So obviously she was not consenting to being touched in a certain way, and they did, and then they ran away. That was a little traumatizing, but it wasn't clear what the course of direction had to be, So that was my very first time hearing about that, and actually seeing, that up close. I was just confused. I was just standing out, and then they came back, and then they still, spoke about the experience, in terms of what happened and how, they felt about it. Nothing negative. It almost looked as though, that had become what they were going to do to her. And now when I think about it, I think this must have happened a number of times with that particular boy.
And so did you think, oh, I need to go and tell my dad, or I need to go and tell somebody about this?
At no point did it occur to me that I needed to speak to anybody. At no point. And the truth is, after we went back to school, I will see similar things happening, back in school as well. So it almost became the system through which you do value judgments around whether or not these were appropriate. But subconsciously, you knew that something was wrong. But as to whether it was okay to tell on somebody, no, it was not. Then even the culture for us as kids at the time, young boys, you're not telling on anybody. You're going to be stereotyped. You're going to be called a snitch, and so really never told on anyone, never.
And so you said that was one incident, and then you were about to share there was another incident.
So back in high school, we will close at about 2:30, and once we're out of school, sometimes we'll hang around at his end, which was in Kanda. A lot of us, the kids, would chat. And then there was one time, there was this Muslim girl who, came with us, to the hangout, and then we were all sitting out talking. Then, this gentleman started groping her. He said, before anybody could say anything, he walked us all out of the house, and locked up, with this girl alone. I never really had the opportunity to find out what ultimately happened, with her. But the groping started before, we eventually left. I don't really know. Never really got to ask, what else happened after. But I can gauge, that she probably either was sexually molested or, this well was much bigger and it was much stronger. Then again, nobody said anything after that.
And when you say nobody, how many of you were there when it happened?
Must have been about maybe 5 or 6 of us, maybe. 5 or 6 of us, yes.
Right. And did any of you turn to him and say, "Don't do that. Don't touch her like that"?
Not to the best of my knowledge. No. My memory is a bit fuzzy on that, but I don't remember anybody telling him not to do that.
Yeah. What's really powerful and interesting for me is that you talk about your not really learning the word and the language around consent at home necessarily. But in the stories that you share, there was a clear learning about silence around men, boys, and their behavior towards girls. and you're in the presence of groups of other boys, and there was a clear understanding that silence was the way to be.
It was never a conversation about whether or not you needed consent. When that was happening, the sense of judgment was always, this is wrong, not because the girl is not consenting or the girl has been charged a certain way, but because sex is wrong for you as a teenager. And that was the way we saw it. So I'll come home, I'm not talking to anybody about this because, sex is still. And I think for a lot of the boys as well, that may have been the construct. Because I remember one, police officer's son who was a very good friend of mine, who equally got, he got confused about some of these things just as I was.
So then when you come to have your first, your own sexual encounters and your own sexual exchanges, how do you navigate consent having not had explicit conversation about consent, but having witnessed boys engage with girls in a way that, like you said, you knew something was wrong, but it wasn't like there was any particular conversation about that?
I do recall my very first incident, which was, once again, I think I must have been final year high school. And so there was no explicit conversation about consent. There was no explicit conversation about consent. But in the process, she says, "Stop, this hurts." Okay, then you stop, right? So at that point, so you didn't have a conversation, do you want to do this? This is okay? No, none of that. Yeah, just two kids who feel that, you like each other, you're in the room, you're just, doing your business. And then all of a sudden, without having spoken to her, you move from simply kissing the person or touching them, you move into doing other things, trying to take the clothes off. And then at a point, she says, "Stop this." Then I stop. I mean, that was my very first encounter. And it's not, now when I reflect on it, it's not clear if the decision to stop was because I needed to consent with her, or was because it's still not clear to me when I think, or the act, the sexual act itself was wrong. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. It's the inability to, as a kid growing up, draw that line, because the subject was taboo and we never spoke about it. Even when it was happening and any of the events I've described came up, today I look back, it is not clear to me if I didn't continue because sex was taboo or because she said no. And I think that conversation is very, very important even today. So when I look back at that incident, and I reflect, honestly, it's not, I can't tell you if the reason for which I stopped was because she said no, or because the act sex was not good and she drew my attention to it. It's not clear to me. My own experience and my own case, I think, is very, very confusing. The reason I say it's very confusing growing up is because I had 5 sisters at home. I was concerned when other boys engaged with my sisters, particularly my sisters were younger than I was, right? One was older, the rest were all younger. What that meant was that subconsciously, somewhere, somehow, there's a part of you, the human being, even though there's not been the very formal education about sex, I can't really pinpoint what it is, but there's a sense of protection. You feel a need to protect your sisters from something like that you see other boys do to other girls.
Right.
That shows that.
Right. Which suggests that it's wrong. There's something wrong.
It's wrong. Right. Okay. The question though is, knowing is wrong, is it because your sister will not consent, or because they shouldn't have sex as a child? Okay. And I think that's very, very important. When you transition from that to a point where you're now late teens, early 20s, you have a girlfriend, you are going out together, and so you look like you consent. When that person's, I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, when she says no, right? Because now it's adult, the act is okay, at least socioculturally. When you're getting with her and she says no, even though she's your partner, in all these cases I've described as, majority of them, the girls were not partners of the boys, so to speak. When she says no and she's your partner, what do you do? Again, I think there was a lot of confusion in that as well, right? Because you had all these narratives that suggested that no, when she says no, she actually means yes, and she's just trying to play hard to get. All those narratives existed, within our conversations as young kids growing up. So it was not clear, even then, if the person said no, whether they meant no or no means no means yes in certain constructs. And so as part of what I will think that my kids have got to understand is that, this business of what's no, not me, no, because again, there's a language that comes to sexual activity. I think that the line has got to be drawn somewhere. And the way that will happen is to have the conversation about sex. Is to have that sexual education. I think for me, it's very important now, because once you open up that conversation and have a conversation, particularly with the boys, then you get to know, or they get to understand that no actually means no.
So this is what is interesting about this that I want to ask you to comment on. That the idea that a girl's no would be litigated at all, would be questioned, would be reflected on at all. That the mere fact that she says no in and of itself isn't enough to affect behavior and to affect a man's behavior towards her in terms of her body and sex. And so what's really interesting for me is that although you talk about not having active sex education in terms of being at home, there's a very clear sex education among you as boys about entitlement and power, a total absence of boundaries, and the expectation of silence among you as boys when somebody engages in behavior where your radar is telling you that there's something wrong, she's struggling, the noise, none of this sounds right. But what you discuss is that you either can or can't do it. So there's a learning around the objectification of girls. That's clearly being learned, even though it's not expressly being said in terms of behavior. And so what's interesting for me when I think about masculinity and power is less about sex and more about humanity, bodies, and emotionality, and what it means to simply honor what somebody is saying. We gender consent in some ways to justify a certain kind of violence. And so by that I mean, is it clear whether the girl consented or not? But if something inside of you says this is wrong, then there doesn't need to be any other conversation. The reason there is we have a culture that has decided that when it comes to a woman and saying no, that's a whole cause for engagement, discussion, essentially emotional litigation. Within the culture of community, all of those activities that you spoke about witnessing are all very real for girls today. None of those things have necessarily changed. And so I wonder for you, when you think about masculinity in African men, what is it that you think we need to address to change that?
I think that even today, when that conversation is mainstream, a lot of men have a pushback. The reason you find a pushback is because, I summarize it to mean two things. One being that some people are not too comfortable with dealing with their own pasts, and I struggled with that a lot. So I've seen things happen. Being able to have a conversation about how we move forward from there means that you have to confront your own past and ask yourself, what was it that you did that was wrong that needs to be corrected in terms of, the power balances between men and women. I think that a lot of my peers are not prepared to deal with. I think that it's just a matter of understanding what the boundaries, of how men, exercise ourselves as far as our engagement with the other sex is concerned, and whether or not we're crossing a lot of boundaries, and being able to check these, check ourselves on these parameters. And I don't think that a lot of us get the opportunity to do that. And so it's part of the reasons why, they may not have the conversation. So if something needs to shift, at least from their point of view, my view would be that it will start with the conversation. And we being very honest with ourselves, that I witnessed this, I saw that, whether I like it or not, it helped shape the value systems that I hold today, some of which will be problematic. I think that's where the conversation has got to start from. What is unfortunate is that some may acknowledge that, but they may still be involved in different shapes and forms of domineering, dominating, whether it is their own female colleagues who may be same age, or dominating other kids who may be of the opposite sex. These imbalances exist in different ways. And again, it will start with an honest conversation and a self-reflection and accountability from peers, right? So now today, I'm able to hold conversations with my friends when something is wrong, or we hear any of these, issues that break out publicly, we can openly speak about them. The third thing I would say will be, being able to hold ourselves, accountable. That's the way the culture is going to change. If we expect it to change, the change has got to start from us, right? And I think that will be very important, to do going forward. Consent is something that we are actually not talking about. And the reason we're not talking about consent is because we're not having the sex educate, we're not having that education. And I'm not saying education only in school, because now the kids have got phones, they're seeing everything. So it's not just about the formal educational system addressing it, but at home.
So as we close, when you look back at your younger self and you go back and talk to boys at that age, what would you tell your younger self about consent, your body as a boy, what it means to honor that, and what it means to be a witness? What would you say?
What I will say will be summarized, into one thing, which is to talk and ask. Then ask the questions about the things that is happening around. And the reason I will say that is because once that is open, I think the other chips will fall in place. We have a culture that thrives on people being timid and not asking questions and being submissive in literally everything that happens around them. I think that's very bad. So that's the first thing I would say. The third thing will be, just a matter of respect for another human being. I don't think we teach that, growing up. We may talk about it in other social vices, but in terms of sexual education, and simply the balances between boys and girls, men and women, I don't think we do a lot of that constructively. So what I would tell myself, knowing what I know now, will simply be to respect everybody as an individual. Just like I'll respect the boys I'll hang out and play football with, I'm going to respect the girls the same way. And if I'm going to have to ask the boys, permission, or feel uncomfortable to see them in a certain way, same should be happening in the case of the girl.